This episode has been brought to you in part by the Azrieli Music Prizes. Join them in celebrating artistic excellence at the AMP Gala Concert, live from Maison Symphonique in Montreal, happening October 20th at 7:30 p.m. Eastern. Orchestre Metropolitain will premiere award-winning music by laureates Aharon Harla, Iman Habibi, and Rita Ueda. Learn more at azrielifoundation.org/AMP.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the Menschwarmers, your bi-weekly-ish look at the world of Jews and sports. We've been taking a sort of relaxed summer schedule, I would say, in the dog days of summer, or post-dog days, doggish days of summer.
Yeah, we saw that the high holidays were coming up. We needed to gear up for lots of fall sports content for you people and the ongoing shtetl talk that you love so much.
What do you mean by you people?
Both,
I'm just kidding. Obviously, only Jews listen to this podcast.
Both James
No
and our producer Mike both had the same reaction to my comment of you people. I didn't even mean Jews. I meant
you listeners.
You listeners. You people who are presumably listening to our show.
Gabe, how you doing, buddy? What's going on in your life aside from stockpiling Western cream cheese just in case of emergency?
I'm doing good. You know, I'm not too broken up about the Western cream cheese breakdown. I know you think that's crazy talk, but it was a little foamy. It's a little busy for a cream cheese for me.
Really?
Yeah, it's a little busy.
You want a denser cream cheese?
I want a denser cream cheese. I want one where I'm not worried. I want the lox to be like stuck onto it. Like, I feel like if you were to hold a piece of a bagel with cream cheese and lox upside down, the lox would fall off the Western. I want that cream cheese on like cement.
I see. Well, fair enough. It's possible. I think I've mentioned this before. I'm a vegetarian, so I'm not a lox eater. So it's possible that as a non-lox eater, I don't really know what cream cheese goes best with it, or like what you need. My cream cheese is there for cream cheese purposes, not just as lox adhesive.
Do you think that anti-Semites call us lox eaters?
I think if they knew what lox was, well, I guess they probably do. That is a good slur, though. Not enough racial slurs about like people eating. I think potato eater is the only thing, and that sounds like I'm sure the origins of it are like date back to like the potato blight and like terrible things like that. But like if someone was like, "You're a potato eater," I'd be like, "You are accurate. Like that is correct." And
right.
I'm not offended.
I think there's like out-group ones, right? Like I've been called a manja cake before. And like
but that's not exactly. That just means like a white person.
Yeah, it's how Italians refer to the decadent West. Or where I guess the French and the English,
which they're not part of.
Yeah, which we are not part of. We are definitely not part of the decadent West. We say from our podcast microphones. Good intro. Good intro.
Good intro. Good nosh talk to start off the pod. Let's dive right into some sports talk. Should mention off the top that we have a really great interview coming up with Allan Leibel. Allan is a multiple-time Olympian, and he was an Olympian at the 1972 Munich Games, where a number of Israeli athletes and coaches were killed by terrorists. That's part of what we wanted to have him on for, and also talk about his career in sailing and his experience at the Olympics. So stay tuned for that. It's a very interesting interview, and finally a chance for me to talk to another lawyer on the podcast instead of old one undergraduate degree Gabe here.
That's right. I'm a 1 degree man. We haven't talked about sailing on the show, I guess, ever. Historically or otherwise, but there's a great history of sailing in Israel. Israel's first medalist, Gal Fridman, who I think we talked about a couple of years ago in an Olympics episode, won Israel's first gold and I think Israel's first medal overall at any Olympics, both sailing. Right. So there is sort of a history of Jewish sailing. If you were a Jewish camp kid, you probably participated in some sailing too. But Allan was on the Canadian national team as a Jewish athlete. And has a lot of interesting perspective to share about the 1972 Olympics and the tragedies that occurred there.
It's interesting we haven't talked about sailing. I mean, I don't really have much personal connection to it. Sailed, little lasers at camp or whatever. It doesn't really count. But, I think Toronto has a very interesting and definitely not necessarily unique, but interesting history with Jews and sailing, and the Island Yacht Club that sort of grew as a place for Jews to sail when they weren't allowed at some of the other yachting clubs in the city. And, I think it's similar to other sports that signified wealth, let's say, of a early 20th century or mid 20th century area, golf, tennis, other things like that, polo, I suppose, where it's like, well, you don't want to have us in your club, we're going to start our own, and then one day be the only people with money who are still interested in doing this.
And elephant polo,
you'll have to merge with that. You'll have to merge with the Jewish club to stay afloat.
Interesting, though, we talk about the history and Jews and sailing. This isn't necessarily the point of our podcast, and I'm happy to guest on any podcast that would be willing to have me to talk about this. But there's a long history of swashbuckling Jewish piracy.
Is there?
Yeah, when Jews were after the Spanish Inquisition and expulsion from Portugal, a lot of Jewish families moved to sort of South America and the Caribbean and became seafaring, rum drinking pirates.
Wow, that's very cool.
Yeah, lots of Caribbean, a lot of the Caribbean Jews and South American Jews now, I think, are descendants of post Spanish Inquisition Jewish swashbucklers.
It's definitely a rich area of history for us to explore another time. I would love to hear someone tell me about the history of Jewish pirates.
Yeah, I guess it would be Redbeard, black hair. Is that the name of the Jewish pirate? But speaking of non-Jewish, we're excited to bring you on an interview with Allan and talk about his experience. But in the meantime, any exciting news in your world of Jewish sports that you want to talk about this week, James?
Well, I wanted to say we got some great feedback on our last episode and your interview with Lawrence Applebaum from Golf Canada. There are a few golf stories I just wanted to mention. Last week was the FedEx Cup Finals, the end of the PGA Tour season at East Lake Golf and Country Club, I think.
Yes.
East Lake for sure. I'm just not sure if it's golf. East Lake. Yes. Yeah. A very nice club. And Max Homa ended up in 5th place overall, which is great for him. A huge finish for him towards the end of the year. And, a way to really take home a big check in the FedEx Cup, because that really pays out. I don't know if what did Rory get for winning? 11 million or something like that?
18 million. L'chaim.
18 million. L'chaim to Rory. To Rory.
Yeah, absolutely. L'chaim on this.
Yeah, so it was a $75 million prize pool. Max Homa came in 5th and took home $2.75 million.
It's that's a lot huge, of simoleons.
Such a haul. Geez. I know it all seems sort of funny money when you get up there and what the prizes are, but a lot of these golfers are just sort of scratching out a living trying to make it through the year and sustain multiple years. You have injuries. There's not necessarily a big contract behind you the way you have in other sports that keeps you afloat. So $2.75 million, that's great. Good for Max.
Yeah, it's very, very proud of him. A lot of nachas after a real breakout year for him. So
and pride as well. I think as Jews that he hasn't taken the money to join the Saudi Live Tour.
Yeah, he hasn't gone full Bill Goldberg.
Will you be watching Live Golf? You think come September?
No. I don't think so. I have no interest in seeing really any of them.
So just while we're on
Charles Schwartzel battle Louis Oosthuizen, I would watch the European tour, and I don't really watch that.
Yeah, I don't watch that either. So just briefly on the subject of money in golf, I read that the money that they've reported that they're paying these players to join the tour is an advance against future earnings, and they'll have to pay it back on that basis. That is ludicrous. The moral hazard that goes into that, because what is stopping someone from what's causing them to be competitive? This is totally ludicrous. If they're getting paid regardless, if they're not making any money from winning, what's causing them to want to win the tournament? And then what's stopping them from colluding with someone who isn't getting paid as much, hasn't already gotten in advance, to have them win and take the money home? This is such a farce. This is considered is not a competitive sport. It's nonsense. Absolutely.
There is no incentive to win. Other than, I guess, possibility of an additional prize contract. And I guess the potential, right? Like for your mid-tier guys, I guess for everybody, it's more money than you're likely to make on the PGA Tour, but it's not. It's a very different, I guess, opportunity to play something that still doesn't really feel like a golf tournament. 54 hole shotgun starts for money you already have.
So weird.
It's very, very, very bizarre.
Gabe, you talked to Lawrence last week on the eve of the Canadian Open for women's golf. How were any Jews participating? How did Jews fare at that?
We have 3 Jewish stories. The first one, we've talked about her a couple of times. Her name is Elizabeth Sokol. She last week, unfortunately, she actually came in 36th. Sorry, I got confused. She shot 7 under for the tournament, 3 under on her last day, and did quite well. 36. I think it's one of her better finishes of the season.
Hey, not bad.
Totally not bad. There also who didn't make the cut, who I got confused. Golfer Dana Finkelstein, who was also another Jewish golfer, but an interesting Toronto story. Maple Downs member and high school student Lauren Zaretsky, who's the women's amateur national champion of this year, young Jewish girl, made the cut and was the top Canadian amateur in the field. So
wow, good for her.
Big mazel tov to Lauren, and a big thank you to the guy I met on a golf course last weekend who gave me the tip to her story. Another Maple Downs member, but Lauren, if you or any of your family are listening, we'd love to have you on the show, talk about your golf life, and wish you luck heading to Texas Tech, I guess, in the next couple of weeks.
Congratulations.
So big congratulations, big mazel tov, and I'm sure it's the first of many high finishes at various LPGA Tour events. So pretty exciting. We got another MOT on tour, or who looks like she's going to be on tour, and we'd love to talk to you more.
Yeah, good for her. I'm sure we'll continue following her career as she goes through her NCAA career at Texas Tech and hopefully joining the LPGA thereafter.
Absolutely. A lot of good Jewish stories. A lot of good Jewish stories in the LPGA Tour, I guess. Finally, we know that Morgan Pressel, the commentator, was there at the tournament the whole time. She was hanging around Toronto, playing golf, meeting people, I think doing somewhat of a Jewish media tour. We didn't get her on the show this time, but maybe next year, Morgan, we'll have you on our LPGA special.
Sure. Switching over to tennis, we there's obviously some Jewish athletes still alive at the U.S. Open that's going on right now. But I saw that Camilla Giorgi lost in the second round earlier today, unfortunately. She's had a sort of up and down last year. Obviously, winning the Canadian Open was big, but hasn't quite hit that height since then. So, Diego Schwartzman is on to the second round. Denis Shapovalov's off to the second round. I think Taylor Fritz as well.
Taylor Fritz was upset in the first round.
Oh, upset in the first round. You're right. Wow.
Yeah, it was the top ranked American.
Loss.
Big loss by somebody whose name is Brandon Holt. Yeah.
And Gabe, it being just coming up on Labor Day weekend, I thought it would be good to do a little football preview for the upcoming football season. Starting with the junior ranks, the only really notable Jewish player that I want to talk about is now West Virginia University Mountaineers quarterback JT Daniels. First of all, great name, 10 out of 10 QB name. JT is just great.
You don't think about a lot of JTs being Jewish, especially unless their names were like Jacob Tevye.
Yeah, so half Jewish. His mom is Jewish. His dad is not, but I think he was raised within the faith to a certain degree. He had been at Georgia previously, but was sort of blocked, from starting
in the national championship year.
Well, he was on the team, but he was behind Stetson Bennett, who was their sort of surprise starter.
Not Jewish. Not Jewish at all.
But left during the transfer portal and transferred to West Virginia. He is apparently not the only Jew in West Virginia, because I saw an article on Forward about a rabbi in West Virginia. So he is not the only Jew in West Virginia, but he is one of few.
Yes, I've been to Morgantown, where West Virginia University is. So I've been there. It is not a very Jewish place.
And JT Daniels is a huge recruit. He is going to have an uphill battle playing for a team that's, expected to be competitive, but not necessarily a top team. He sort of bounced around and hasn't necessarily, shown what he can do in terms of his football prowess. As I said, top recruit, but sort of blocked at Georgia by another quarterback. He had injuries as well. So this is going to be his, big year to prove himself and prove that he could be an NFL caliber quarterback. He, is going to be in tough right off the bat. They have Pittsburgh. They're playing Pitt on Thursday night.
Is it the opening game
August
of the 1st? Season?
Yeah, I mean, there have been a few games, but this is like the open, this is like the big kickoff week. So we wish him luck. I mean, I think he's someone we're going to follow. He has 40-1 odds to win the Heisman, which is not bad. He's definitely like a dark horse candidate for that. But he's a guy who's a real recruit. He hasn't really had a chance to prove himself the last few years, but we're going to see what he can do.
Deal.
Exactly. Expected to be a big deal. I think he absolutely can be, and we'll see. We'll have to see what happens. Continue following his career. And if they can upset Pitt, that would be a huge start for his season.
And moving on to sort of, I guess, professional football from college, I'm sure we'll find about other college stories throughout the season.
Yeah.
We lost a good one in the retirement of, the retirement of Super Bowl winning tackle Mitch Schwartz.
Yeah. So I wanted to talk about that. It hasn't been a great offseason for Jews in NFL. So as you said, Mitch Schwartz retired. I don't think he had been on the roster last year necessarily, but he won a Super Bowl with the Kansas City Chiefs. Ali Marpet also retired, tackle for Tampa Bay, who was on the team last year and was part of their Super Bowl winning team back in 2020. Back in 2021, the 2020 season, the Tom Brady year.
Yes.
Those two guys retired, and not saying that's bad. Wish him well. Obviously, Mitchell Schwartz for sure is going to have a career in media. His brother Jeff does a lot of media stuff as well. Big presence on Twitter. Ali Marpet, I think, has a real career ahead of him. But in other news, I want to talk about two other active players. Josh Rosen, the quarterback, formerly of the Arizona Cardinals, formerly of the Miami Dolphins, then signed with Cleveland Browns this offseason. He was just released the other day. So,
and now
it's just been kicked around. He has not had a shot. I mean, getting released by the Browns is probably the lowest it gets. Even though their star quarterback is suspended for the first 10 games of the season.
Yes. This is now the sixth franchise that has moved on him.
So we'll see. We'll see if he gets picked up somewhere to be a backup. But it might be getting late early, as they say for Josh Rosen, chosen Rosen. And I don't know. It's tough. Football's tough. There's only so many spots. There's new guys coming in. I would love to see him get a chance somewhere.
Yeah,
I think he was not. He wasn't bad in the opportunities that he had last year.
Yeah, I mean, even his first Arizona season was not.
No, it wasn't terrible.
It wasn't good, but it wasn't. It was a middling rookie season.
Yeah, so he didn't really get much of a chance last year in Atlanta, but when he was in Miami, he was not terrible. Like for a young guy, he wasn't good, but he wasn't the worst player ever. So. I think with a chance, this guy could still maybe be something. Who knows? There's so few chances. He was a high draft pick for a reason, 10th overall.
Absolutely.
And the other cut that I think was more of a shock to a lot of people was that tight end Anthony Ferkser, who signed last offseason with the Falcons, was cut from their roster as well. So that's an odd one.
Yesterday.
I didn't really see any good explanation for that. I think he's going to get picked up somewhere. He's a quality blocking tight end. He's
a quality player who's also a Harvard grad and has had a couple of good seasons on a couple of good teams. Like he was drafted, I think, by the Jets or first started his career with the Jets and then played a little bit on Kansas City and then had 4 years with Tennessee, including a couple of playoff appearances. I think he's, expected to find another job. I would expect so too. There's always going to be a job for an athletic tight end who went to Harvard. Seems like a place where you would want a smart player. It's a shame, but we still have a couple of Jews left in the league. Couple specifically. Let's talk about Greg Joseph, my dude.
Greg Joseph, I think, should.
He's South African. That's what I was doing.
Anything that gets your South African accent coming out. I mean, I think he moved to Florida when he was like 6. I think he moved to Florida when he was like 6. So I don't think he really has any South African accent at all.
Probably not. But his parents, Glenn and Ilana, certainly do.
Yeah, he is the Vikings place kicker. He will be kicking field goals and kickoffs for the Vikings, I guess. I assume he's doing kickoffs as well.
I think so.
Yeah, and he's a guy you might hear about. I mean, the Vikings are probably going to be better this year than people think. They should be okay.
I think so. Like, he had a pretty good season last year, 83%. Field goals. He didn't get into that many games, but he looks like he'll get into a bunch more. Kicked off a lot, made a lot of extra points last year. I think we can expect to see a lot of Greg Joseph this year.
Definitely.
And he's also sort of a very, very proud Jew. Went to day school growing up in Miami, or just outside of Miami in Boca. As every good Jewish boy has been going back to school during the off seasons to get his MBA. You got to have a backup. You got to have a backup.
And one of the other Jewish stars of the league that we wanted to talk about, sticking in the NFC North, is Green Bay Packers running back AJ Dillon.
Dillon,
BBYO, whatchamacallit, guest speaker, AJ Dillon. There's a great video of him at the big BBYO conference.
Absolutely,
he is technically second on the depth chart behind Aaron Jones. But I think this year is probably going to be more of a share. Probably gonna be more of a timeshare. I think AJ Dillon, he is a sleeper fantasy guy for a lot of people. I think there's an acknowledgement that he is blocked by Aaron Jones right now, but he's the number one handcuff in fantasy. If Aaron Jones gets injured, AJ Dillon's going to slot in as a top 5 running back every year. If fantasy football is your thing. So, he's definitely someone to watch in your draft. If you are at a fantasy football draft, feel free to pick him and say, he's Jewish. And people will be impressed by that. Yeah.
He's not only is he, he was a much surprisingly, and I say surprisingly because, Jews of color sort of are not necessarily seen in professional football, but not only that, he grew up relatively religious. He went to Hebrew school, he went to synagogue, he is a Jewish man who has had a lot of Jewish experience in his life, and is quite proud of it. Speaking of BBYO and all over Wisconsin, talking about his experience being welcomed as a Jew of color. So we're very proud of him and happy to see him. And like you said, one of the budding stars of the league.
I think this is going to be his breakout year. I think he's going to become a real household name in football, and we're going to see him step up and really kick some ass in Green Bay this year.
I think
hopefully more than 6. Hopefully gets a lot of pitches from Aaron Rodgers and is able to stay at least 6 feet apart from him. But sometimes
that's true.
Sometimes you gotta get close for a handoff.
Yeah, I wonder if AJ Dillon's parents are worried that he is an unvaccinated colleague. Yeah. There's just no thing they would do, be unvaccinated. So they're worried about being an unvaccinated colleague. I think there's 3 more Jews in the NFL. There's Sam Sloman, who's a kicker. Sam Sloman is a great name, by the way. Sounds like a character in a Philip Roth novel. I've got my buddy Sam Sloman. He's a kicker for the Steelers. He's on the practice squad now, but with any luck, he'll make the team. He's been re-signed on their practice squad for 2 years. And he's still on it. They're on the reserve squad, I should say, as well as an OT for the Seattle Seahawks. Jews seem to be represented in the tackle game. Jake Curran, or Curhan, I believe it's pronounced Curran. Grew up in San Francisco. Another proud Jew who also has his MBA. Got to have a backup, and his from Berkeley. So pretty good schools these Jewish boys go to.
Yeah, and Michael Dunn, the guard for the Cleveland Browns, also Jewish. So definitely guys we'll continue to check in on. It's tricky with
tricky with stats we can give you guys.
Yeah, exactly. It's tricky with non-position players. It's tricky with non-position players. You can just be like, well, this guard and this guard played last week. That's what we can say. And let me say, I'm not putting down the incredibly difficult work that guards and tackles and all kinds of other players in football, the incredibly difficult role they have. But it's just hard to say, they stood a guy up or they let up a sack or, there are advanced stats about it, but it's different. It's different than saying AJ Dillon scored 2 touchdowns last week.
No,
if that happens, that's a nice thing to announce.
But we could absolutely say Drew Lock didn't get sacked today. So good work, Jake. Mazel tov, Jake. No sacks for Drew Lock.
Just a little harder to quantify.
Just a little harder to quantify, but you're right. With Sam Sloman and Greg Joseph, we'll know exactly how many kicks they make and how from far away.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there for now with football. Obviously, we'll keep that in mind in the next few months as the season develops. And why don't we go now to our interview with Allan Leibel. Well, we're very glad today to be joined by Allan Leibel, a Toronto area lawyer and also a 3-time member of Canada's Olympic team. Hi, Allan. How are you?
Great. Thanks for having me, guys. Good to meet you both.
Welcome to the show. Welcome to the Menschwarmers.
Thanks so much for joining us. We wanted to have you on, especially now because we're coming up on the 50th anniversary of the Munich massacre, which occurred on September 5th, September 6th, 1972. And we wanted to talk to somebody who was there. Allan, we know that you were part of the Canada's Olympic sailing team at that time in Munich. So we just wanted to talk to you a little bit about your experience of what happened, your recollections of the days around the events, and take it from there.
Sure. Just to put it in context in terms of my Olympic experience and how it was affected by Munich, I was on the Canadian Olympic team in 72, which is when the Munich massacre occurred. Then again in 1976 when it was in Montreal. And then I was on the Olympic team for 1980, which was to be held in Russia. In the end, Canada and the U.S. and a few other Western countries boycotted those Olympics. And it was all one change of a lot of politics involved in not nearly as much sport, which was a shame. But so going back to 1972, it's interesting to note that the previous time that Germany hosted the Olympic Games was in 1936. And that Olympic Games in Germany was presided over, quite conspicuously presided over by Adolf Hitler. He was front and center at those Olympics. And you have to remember that was before World War II, that was before the Holocaust, and that was before the creation of the State of Israel. And then the next Olympics, which we're now talking about, was in 1972. And by then, of course, the war was over. The Holocaust was a great tragedy. And most importantly, the State of Israel had been created. And that sets the stage for the 72 Olympics, where Germany was again the host. And Germany was out, understandably, to demonstrate to the world that they were now a friendly country, and this was going to be a friendly celebration of sport. And frankly, they went out of their way to create that atmosphere. And it was in the context of that, and in the context, therefore, of a very low amount of security that the massacre occurred. And I guess you two guys are too young to have been around when it occurred, but in 1972, the Olympics were in September. It was about a 10-day event. And on about the 5th day, to everybody's incredible surprise, the Israeli athletic area, which was part of a compound in the Olympic Village, was raided by terrorists. And there were 11 Israeli hostages taken. They were kept in their own apartment, captured by the terrorists. I must tell you, when news first spread of what was happening, a lot of people thought it was a joke, that it wasn't really happening, or there were people playing a bit of a hoax.
And was this is you in the village, weren't sure what was actually going on?
Well, just to clarify, there were several different villages rearranged around the Olympic facilities. I was in a different village. But yes, there was no way for us to know what was happening except in the news. And interestingly, and I guess deliberately, the terrorists had chosen the Olympics and chosen Munich because the eyes of the world, and more importantly, the cameras of the world, were already trained on the Olympic facilities in the Olympic Village. So suddenly, we're all watching television. That's where we saw it all, just as everyone in the world was watching it, because the cameras were now trained, instead of on the track and field events, They were trained on this apartment complex where there were guards with rifles all over the place. And as I said, many of us thought they were just kidding until the terrorists threw one of the Israeli athlete's dead body, out into the corridor. And then everybody suddenly realized this was real. So the cameras were trained on it for approximately, I think, 48 hours. Everybody was praying that there would be some sort of peaceful resolution of this. There apparently was some negotiation going on between the German officials and the terrorists, and ultimately a so-called arrangement was made whereby the terrorists and the Israeli hostages would be put in a bus, taken to the airport, and then flown out of the country to a destination that was not clear, but it was in the Middle East somewhere. The German officials had a plan to try to liberate the hostages. And they waited until the hostages were loaded onto this plane, along with some of the terrorists. I guess most of the terrorists were on that plane. And suddenly the German officials broke through with guns, trying to save and rescue the hostages. But it did not work and resulted in the terrorists simply shooting all of the Israelis on the plane. Most of the terrorists themselves were killed by the German officials, and 3 were taken into custody, kept in jail, and as I understand it, ultimately were released back to their home country as part of a prisoner trade. So, I mean, that's what physically occurred. That's what the movies all show. That's what the history books all show. It was a terrible, terrible event. I can tell you that once it was over, of course, no one knew how it was going to end until it ended. It ended quite suddenly. But once it was over, there was a question, what should the Olympic officials do? Should they cancel the rest of the Olympics? And there was some support for that. Or should they continue? And I think the prevailing sentiment, I believe supported by the State of Israel, was that if we cancel the Olympics, the terrorists win, and therefore it had to go on. So there was another 2 or 3 days of mourning, even in the Olympic villages, and then they completed the Olympic Games.
And just to jump in here, what do you think? You know, as an athlete, both at the games at the time, did you think the game should go on? And now, sort of as someone who's lived a lot more of life, been to a different Olympics, how do you look upon that decision today?
I'll tell you that at the time, it would not have disturbed me if they'd simply canceled the whole thing. It would not have bothered me in the least. I had gone home. I'd have been full of grief like everybody else was, because at that point, it was no longer about the Olympics. It was about a terrorist attack, about 11 dead Israelis, Israeli athletes. And to me, the Olympics were kind of meaningless at that point. But I do understand why there was a feeling that they can't let terrorism rule the world. They got to demonstrate that terrorism doesn't work, that life will continue despite what some terrorists might do. So I understand that sentiment as well. And that's the decision that was made, and I accepted it too.
A lot has been made in the years since then of the unpreparedness from the German officials and the German, Olympic organizers in terms of security, especially. Was there any feeling a relation to that in advance of the hostage taking? Like among Olympic athletes, was there any feeling of this is not being run properly, or things are too loose, or did that only become apparent afterwards?
Yeah, there was no such feeling. I mean, no one even gave a thought to security. We were in Germany. It was a beautiful, renewed country, and it was supposed to be a friendly Olympics, and it was wide open. And you ask a great question, but in hindsight, things were done differently, and that's why I make mention of the next Olympics, which was 76. security was incredibly tight in the 76 Olympics, just to try to avoid any such thing. But to answer your question, no, there was no thought of it at the time.
And I take it that made it.
Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I assume that made things feel differently by the time Montreal rolled around in 76, that things were more closed off, or that there was more security, more checkpoints, things like that.
Well, I can tell you exactly. The Olympic residences were all heavily guarded. You'd get on a bus to go from the residence to your sport venue, and it would be heavily guarded and policed. You guys will laugh, but even out on the race course where I was, the sailing race course, the Coast Guard had created a circle of about a 2-mile diameter, and no non-competing boats were allowed in the circle by police. Wow. So
well,
yeah,
I
the
think
security was awesome.
I think understandably, I mean, obviously the tenor of the Olympics sort of changed, I think, after Munich in a real way in terms of, what it needed to be, or the protection. But alongside that, aside from the security at the games particularly, do you have an opinion, or do you have a feeling of how the Olympic movement or the IOC has sort of treated Munich, how it's honored the victims of Munich in the years since? We've heard a lot of criticism from some of the survivors, or the surviving widows and children of the people who were killed in Munich, about their sort of feeling that the Olympics just wants to sort of bury it and not really talk about it. Is that something that you've experienced as someone who's sort of an Olympic alumnus?
I've heard the criticism, and I will forever feel badly for the families of those who were killed. It's not up to me to. I guess I just don't know the answer to your question as to whether there's been enough honor given to those people. I know, for example, about 15 or 20 years ago, because my son was competing in basketball, I attended the Maccabea Games in Buenos Aires. And there was an immense tribute to those Israeli athletes, and it was really heart-wrenching. I remember being at one of the opening ceremonies, and the whole place was in tears. So I can understand that there continues to be a real feeling of sorrow and grief, and it's not going to be erased. And yes, I've heard people criticize that the IOC has not properly remembered the event. I've heard the criticism. I don't know that I share it, but I don't criticize it either.
Allan, turning a little bit to your own personal history, can we talk a little bit about how did you get involved with sailing to the point where you were able to compete for Canada at an Olympic level?
Well, were you a camp guy? Please tell me it was camp.
No, it was anything but camp. My family rented a cottage up at Lake Simcoe. My father had an 8-foot rowboat. He managed to put a sail on the centerboard and a rudder on it. And as a little kid, I sailed endlessly. And I had no idea what was happening, but I guess I was learning to sail pretty fast without even a thought about it. And I was invited when I was in college to steer one of the boats that my buddies had. It happened to be an Olympic class. We didn't have any thought of Olympics. I sailed it for a couple of weeks. We did well enough that we continued. And 2 years later, we won the trials. The boat was on a Hercules jet over to Germany, and that's how it got started. It's just as simple as that. But sorry, it wasn't camp. It was just hanging out in a little rowboat.
I mean, that's an amazing story. And where did you go to school? Also in Canada?
Oh, yeah. I've always lived in Toronto. Always lived in Toronto.
I love that story, but it really speaks to a different time of amateur sport. And now I assume whoever is going to, or most of the people going to represent Canada in sailing, have been sailing at a, high level and on the right disciplined boats and with coaches for a long time and all that, as opposed to you, it sounds like just tooling around in a rowboat on in the summertime.
Yeah, it has changed dramatically over the years, and you've characterized the change pretty well. When I was doing my Olympic campaigns, I was either a student or a lawyer. Well, nobody could do that today. In fact, right. The government, the Canadian officials wouldn't even let you try out for the team if you were trying to do that. But in those days, with a lot of discipline, I was able to do both. Again, you wouldn't do it today. And the other thing was, most of my training was done on a sailboat. Today, the young sailors, most of their training is done in the gym. And that's because of a change in the type of boats and that sort of thing. And also the whole element of professionalism has changed. I was aiming to be a lawyer. Most Olympic sailors today are aiming to be professional sailors.
And as we talk about Olympics today, your Olympic experience several decades ago, obviously the sports have changed, the games have changed, the experience has changed. Do you still follow the Olympics?
I certainly do. I just find it fabulous to watch, and I enjoy keeping tabs on the results. But yeah, I think the Olympic movement is still very much alive. And if it's treated well, I think it's generally for the good of the world. I think it's horribly abused because because there's so much focus on it. It is so easy to use it for purposes having nothing to do with sport. And as I mentioned, the 1980 Olympics were boycotted by us for such an ironic reason. When you think of it, it was because Russia invaded Afghanistan. And then 20 years later, the U.S. invaded Afghanistan. But, things were different. And then the boycott in 1980 led to a further boycott in 1984, where the Eastern Bloc countries said, well, if you wouldn't come to our games in 80, we're not coming to your games in 84 in Los Angeles. I think it goes to show you a little bit, we talk about the intersection of sports and politics a lot, but people have been having this debate for at least 50 years, if not more, where sports and politics intersect. And unfortunately, it can lead to murders and deaths, and it's not a new problem. It's certainly not a new problem, but I think that leaving out the terrorist attacks, I think trying to use the athletes, remember these athletes train for 4 years, 8 years or more for this one thing, and using them as pawns is just, it really is ridiculous, and especially because it's done so often. And wait till the next Olympics with Russia involved. Who knows what they're going to do with that?
Right. In the years since your Olympic career, have you kept up with sailing? Have you continued to be involved with sailing at any level, or continued sailing personally?
I am 100% still involved in sailing. I still compete. I competed this weekend. Obviously, the nature of the sailing has to change given age and things like that. But I love the sport, and I'll just keep doing it. Absolutely. And I'm a better technical sailor than I was back then. I'm not as athletic, obviously.
Right. I mean, I guess, it's interesting in the Toronto context, sailing has this sort of veneer as originally a sort of Jews excluded activity. But of course, I mean, the Island Yacht Club's been, it was started more than 70 years ago. So there's always been a sort of inclusive Jewish sailing contingent as well. That's, I'm assuming continuing to thrive with lots of young Jewish sailors out there.
First of all, your conclusion is correct. There's a lot of good young Jewish sailors out there. The Island Yacht Club was established back, as you said, I think about 70 years ago, because, as I understand it, Jews were not welcomed in other clubs. That has changed dramatically.
Right.
And I belong to several yacht clubs in Toronto, and one of them is not the Island Yacht Club, as a matter of fact. So
you wouldn't belong to any club that would have you as a member.
That's
the most Jewish thing you could have done.
That's right.
That's good to hear.
I want to ask you as well, something we ask with every athlete we talk to, either when you were in the Olympics in 72 or 76 or now, do you pay attention to who's Jewish?
If it happens to be publicized, I would pay attention. I mean, back in 72, you guys wouldn't remember this, obviously. Mark Spitz.
Never heard of him. No idea who that is. I've never heard of him.
So Mark Spitz won 7 gold medals in swimming in 72, and he made no secret of his religion.
And it's something you have a brotherhood with him, both the 72 Olympics and being Jewish, and you always will.
Well, I actually had the honor of being a co-speaker with him at a Jewish fundraising event not long ago, maybe 10 years ago. He's a really interesting character.
Definitely.
And you can understand how a guy like that would have been so committed to winning, because he thought about nothing other than winning. And maybe that's the sentiment that you need.
It's interesting, I don't know what it means necessarily, but it is interesting that 72 is marked by those two sort of significant events in Jewish history, obviously the massacre and also Mark Spitz's, dominant performance, and what was the most dominant Olympic performance ever. And for the next 30 odd years afterwards until Phelps. So I don't know. There's some commentary to be made about intertwining those, moments
triumph and tragedy.
Triumph and tragedy. But
I suppose, but even Mark admitted that the tragedy certainly overweighed his victories.
Right. Well, Allan, I think we should wrap it up there. We want to thank you again so much for joining us. It's been a true honor having you as a guest. Always great to have an Olympian on and someone who's represented their country so well. So thanks again for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Well, thanks again to Allan for joining us. Very informative and interesting to hear his perspective on being an athlete at the 1972 Munich Olympics. And we should say that just earlier today, the survivors, the widows and children of the 11 Israeli athletes who were killed as hostages struck a deal with the German government for damages in relation to their loved ones, their family members being killed. They agreed to a 28 million euro payment. There had been significant disagreement about the nature of the deal, but it was just struck. We're 4 or 5 days away from the 50th anniversary, so that's great. That's real, just breaking news. We're not breaking it, obviously, but it's just been recently reported as we're recording this earlier today. So that is great to hear. Very nice that those families will get that compensation. And I think the majority of it will be used to continue to fight for justice here and to publicize the nature of this event and the sort of legacy that it carries with those people.
That's absolutely a very good news, and there's been a sort of I don't know if it's a long history, but reparations are hard to come by, and when they come, it's usually good.
Yeah. So that's, I suppose, a bittersweet but a good note to end things on in our look back at the 1972 Munich Olympics and Munich Massacre.
I think so too. Any other any other stories for the next week before we say goodbye?
Just wanted to mention that Sue Bird's Seattle Storm are in the WNBA playoffs still. I think they're up a game.
They're up a game on Las Vegas.
Right
in the semifinals.
In the semis,
thing.
Yeah.
Vegas is the number one seed and certainly favored to win the championship, and a longtime rival of Seattle. So it'll be a great series.
Seattle's a shot. Yeah.
Seattle's absolutely got a shot. Sue's last year to go out with her 5th ring. That would be pretty cool.
Yeah, Sue's last dance. As always, we're brought to you by the Canadian Jewish News. You can find all Canadian Jewish News content, including our suite of podcasts at thecjn.ca. If anyone has good insight into a new cream cheese alternative for those of us in the Greater Toronto area, feel free to drop us a line. You can reach us at Menschwarmers on Twitter, and you should like and subscribe to this podcast wherever you get it. Then it will be delivered right to you in your podcast feed. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much, and please tell your friends about this show.